Good morning. My name is Constantino Xavier. I'm a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in the Foreign Policy Program. Welcome to this first series of discussions called In Dialogue. Today, we're pleased to have with us Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who is a former Foreign Secretary, has a distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service, and served as National Security Advisor until 2014. We're here with Ambassador Menon to discuss the war in the Ukraine, and we'll have a discussion on the various implications also for India of this crisis. Most importantly, Ambassador Menon, of course, is our distinguished fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, where this series we try to engage different experts like him on various policy relevant issues. So Ambassador Menon, thanks for being here, and I think we'll start with three nitty-gritty process-oriented questions about which you know a lot, having served at the apex of decision-making in national security and foreign policies as National Security Advisor. Drawing back a bit to the initial days of the crisis, if you could help us understand how the government deals with these crises. This has happened in Georgia, it happens in various parts of Asia where India has faced these crises. But first one is, how do you assess the risk, for example, of invasion? For that you need good intelligence on the ground or in a region. Possibly many European countries, including many intelligence services in Europe, were surprised also by the sudden attack from Russia on the Ukraine. How do you deal with that uncertainty when you're sitting there and assessing, will Russia attack or not, and to what extent?
Well, thank you for having me, Tino, and thank you for asking me impossible questions, actually, on an ongoing war. The government of India has dedicated structures whose function it is to make these assessments. You have different hierarchies, the intelligence hierarchies, the Ministry of External Affairs, the various parts of government. And the National Security Council is supposed to bring it all together. And if there are conflicting assessments, we used to do this in the Joint Intelligence Committee, in the JIC, but it's ultimately the function of the National Security Council, because that brings it to the highest political level in the country. And that's where you reconcile assessments, come to a judgment of what's happening. In the Ukrainian case, I think it's slightly complicated, because what you've seen is a sort of phase transformation in an ongoing crisis. In fact, it's actually an ongoing war. There's been a proxy war going on in the Ukraine since 2014. And there's been a Ukrainian crisis since much earlier, since Ukraine declared an intention to join NATO, and NATO expressed a willingness to actually admit Ukraine, Georgia, other countries which Russia considers essential to her security. I've said this before. The core problem is that the eastern borders of Ukraine are less than 300 kilometers from Moscow. But equally, the western borders of Ukraine are less than 100 kilometers from Vienna, Prague, Bratislava, Warsaw, a host of European capitals, less than 300 from Berlin, for instance. So for either side in this equation, to see the other ensconced with missiles, troops, etc., in the Ukraine, is going to look like a big threat to their security.
Sounds like we're back in the 70s. We could be having this discussion.
Maybe in the late 19th century Europe, I think we're. But mobilization times are much quicker now.
But specifically on this, how do you deal with conflicting assurances? I'm sure the Russians were reassuring India and saying, we will not attack. We saw that. At the same time, you may have information saying this is not how it looks like if you're mobilizing troops.
Anyone who's going to attack is not going to tell you he's about to attack. He's not going to signal. In fact, he's going to put in place a series of deception measures to convince you that he's not, which is why you come to your own independent judgment. And that's why you need not just one set of eyes on it, but you need intelligence, defense, diplomatic, political, various kinds. You need people on the ground. But ultimately, this sort of assessment depends on assessing somebody's intention. And intention capability is much easier to assess. It's a hard fact. Either you know it or you don't know it. And if you don't know it, you know how to find out about it. Intention is in people's minds.
And especially Putin's mind is not easy.
To get into a mind-reading exercise. I think part of the problem in this case, at least, was I remember thinking that the Russians would move in militarily relatively early in the process, because the moment the US started announcing that they're going to invade, it's going to happen next Tuesday, no, it'll happen next Wednesday, you know, they had actually created a situation where if the Russians hadn't moved in, it would look as if they had caved in the face of threats. And you know, everything one knows about President Putin suggests that if you push him, he'll push back. He's unlikely to accept that kind of situation. So I think then it became clear something would happen. But I don't think anybody was clear about how far Russia would go. Because the numbers that they had in the initial build-up, 150,000 troops, was not enough to actually occupy all of Ukraine. I mean, they're now bringing in more troops. And this is why I think in the first few days of the war, you've had this fog, you know, where people claim victory, oh, we've stopped them, they haven't. Basically, I mean, today, if you look at the situation on the ground, the Russians have built a land bridge to Crimea. So the Sea of Azov, they've actually, the Ukrainian forces on the line of contact in Donbass, you know, Donetsk and Lugansk, run the risk of some encirclement behind them. They'll have to decide pretty soon whether they stay where they are and get encircled or not. And Kiev is under implicit threat by a huge number of armored forces. So, but we're still in the middle of a war, you know, and it's still early days yet. Don't forget, I mean, 71, it took 13 days to get to Dhaka. Even Desert Storm, which is the example of successful war, you know, quick prosecution, 26 days. That's not a short period. So I'd be very careful jumping to conclusions about how the war is going or about what military objectives Russia is seeking.
So two more quick process-oriented questions before we zoom out a little more. But citizens, expatriates, India had up to 20,000 citizens stuck in the Ukraine, and finance. You know, people say that there's not a very strong economic relation between India and Russia, but trade is around 7 to 9 billion a year. There is an important, you know, exchange going on there. I think the Reserve Bank of India just announced stopping payments towards trade with Russia. So on those two immediate issues, I'm sure there's also a lot of thinking in government immediately, right? Bringing citizens back and managing these financial flows with one of your most relevant economic partners.
Well, I think we brought, and it's quite an achievement actually in these circumstances of an invasion of war, to have brought 17,000 out of 20,000 people back already is quite an achievement. Many of them found their own way home. But the bulk of our people have actually come back. But the hardest part is now, those who are still stuck, who are still in there, and our ability to reach in and bring them out is naturally limited, as is everybody else's. We're not the only ones in this situation. The Israelis, for instance, have the same problem of isolated Jewish communities, both in the Ukraine and in Russia, and which is why they've been very careful in what they've said.
So that conditions your diplomacy,
that conditions your approach to. On the trade and the economic stakes, you know, we have fairly sizable stakes with Ukraine as well, and with Russia. It's not so much the sheer volume in terms of value, it's also the quality of what we do with them. Simple example, frigates, for instance. We're buying Russian frigates with Ukrainian engines. Now that kind of thing is great.
Critical minerals, I think nickel, for example.
I mean, the whole
fertilizer industry.
Most non-ferrous metals, the critical ones, we have to import. It's essential for our economy. And Russia is one of the biggest sources of these. So there's a whole host of factors which matter here. So frankly, for us, the quicker the war ends, diplomacy takes over, the better. And I think that really is what we should be aiming at as quickly as possible. Short-term, tactical, yes, get your people out, see what alternate, how you can minimize the economic harm. But all these second-order effects that we're going to face, the effect on the world economy, on commodity, energy, fertilizer prices going through the roof. I think oil actually hit $116 for a brief second yesterday. So those effects are really going to, and we are going to have to develop a strategy for that.
So
but that means that we need to be more than just reactive or tactical.
Which you do in the first days and weeks, obviously, which is important.
That's
but that second order,
but you need to look at the second order effects and develop a different, because this is a huge shift. I mean, if you look at that part of the world, the last big sort of seismic shift like this was Georgia, 2008. And again, it was triggered.
In the Balkan crisis before then, maybe.
Yeah, but I think Georgia was a real, because, and in both these cases, the West has been willing to take a stand in public and to run up the flag and ask everybody else to salute it, but not to actually intervene militarily or to put boots on the ground. Which suggests to me that there is space there for an independent Indian position which is forward-leaning, which actually offers a way forward. And for countries, and I think you will find that there are lots of other countries in that position.
What would that independent position look like?
Well, firstly, I think to establish your credibility, you should call it what it is, an invasion and a war. I think this idea that you can get away by, ducking the issue, call it what it is, establish your credibility. Secondly, make it quite clear that that there are legitimate interests on all sides involved. And the hard security interests that I mentioned, of Ukraine's position, of the Russians feeling threatened, but Western Europe feeling threatened as well. And that therefore, the way forward, neither war, nor invasion, nor name-calling, or proxy war, is going to lead to a solution or to addressing these concerns. The only way to address these concerns is around a table together, where you recognize each other's legitimate security interests and find a formula which guarantees mutual security. To my mind, that's obvious. It has been for a long time. It is for Ukraine to be neutral, non-aligned as it were. Just as Austria is neutral, Finland is neutral. And frankly, you need the basis of some new European security construct. Now, in the excitement and the emotion of war, and in today's situation, maybe this is a hard thing to do. But if you want to get out of this situation, which is causing so much suffering, and which frankly doesn't help. I mean, how does invading the Ukraine, from Russia's point of view, help? It only consolidates the Ukrainian sense of nationalism. It consolidates the Western military alliance. You've seen German rearmament. You've seen the consequences. I don't see it contributing to Russia's security.
Moldova requesting EU membership.
Asking EU membership.
Sweden rethinking its position
I mean, the whole,
on NATO.
And vice versa. Fighting to the last Ukrainian and arming them, I don't see how that contributes to Western Europe's security. They've had to forego now Nord Stream, gas, energy effects, all these. Frankly, I don't see how it's in anybody's interest. So find a way forward, and frankly, I think India is in the perfect position to actually offer our good officers. So I would.
But hasn't Prime Minister Modi said that when he said he wants a return to diplomacy,
as long as you don't call it what it is, you're not staking out an independent position, you're balancing. And if you look at most of the debate in India, it's about, we can't do without Russia, we can't do without the US. Yes, they can't replace each other in our scheme of things. The US is not willing to do nuclear submarines with you or to actually co-produce, co-develop sensitive defense technology, like BrahMos in India with you, the way the Russians have been for a long time and still are.
Which is now being sold to the Philippines by India.
But neither can Russia offer you the kind of market access, civilian technologies, education, you name it,
trade.
Economic. I mean, that the US does. The US is essential to the transformation of India.
So India is trying to appease both sides.
But it's not about balancing them. It's about following India's interests, about a proactive Indian stance, rather than just balancing them and trying not to offend. You will offend both anyway.
So better
But then do it at least in your own interest, rather than,
So it'll hurt relations with the US, but it'll be more frank.
It won't
and hurt Russia relations with Russia.
I don't think it'll
disappoint both.
You're dealing with realists on both sides. They know, and they will actually respect you more for standing up for yourself.
And standing up would be, for example?
Saying quite clearly that it's a war, that it's an invasion.
And for the Americans?
Saying quite clearly that this kind of name-calling leads nowhere, that you can't fight to the last Ukrainian.
So would you say that this is also a legacy problem of the 2000s, the Ukraine? Is it something like Georgia that now satisfies Biden to rally political support?
I've always thought that that's a cop-out. When people say this is a historical legacy.
No, legacy of the US, liberal, interventionist, Western, we can do this.
I'm not going to go there. I mean, the fact is you have a situation today. If you want to settle it, if you want to move forward, there are logical ways out of this. But it's not a hopeless situation where there's no off-ramps.
But it may require a mindset change maybe from the West in that sense.
I assume that people are rational enough to follow their self-interest. And I think the argument to be made to them is not that you have to change your mindset, clean your brains. No, I think the argument to be made is it's in your interest, just like it's in mine. But it's also, it has to be in the other guy's interest too. Otherwise, he's not going to implement it. So for me, the argument is really from interest and reason. And rather than getting to who's responsible and what did you do 5 years ago and what did you do 2 years ago, and that way is disaster.
So on the Russian side, I assume standing up would be also calling it what it is.
Saying that an invasion is not the right way.
To the Americans, it would be continuing trading in defense with Russia and not letting the West curtail that autonomy in India.
You have to, and this is why I say that you're India. I mean, you're not just a small weak country. So you stake out a position which suits your interests.
Finding alternatives to sanctions also,
which you have done
with Iran,
past, which you did in the past with Iran. You did it with Myanmar. You did it, in various cases.
And didn't derail the relationship with Europe or the US.
Because you are dealing with rational people. I mean, that assumption I make.
Most. Let's hope so. One question I have, if you may hypothesize a little bit with me here, is on, we focus a lot on the defense relationship with Russia, right? It's been in the big debates these days on how much does India depend on it? Could it use it as leverage over the Russians, since you're actually an importer, right? And the major source of exports of Russian defense. But beyond defense, the last 2 years, we've seen a rapprochement happening between Delhi and Moscow on some issues. In some ways, there's been, an investment, I think, from India in the relationship. President Putin came here a few months ago. On Afghanistan, we've seen interesting, discussions happening. We had the Chinese and Indian foreign ministers meeting in Moscow. I won't use the M word, but maybe the facilitation word. What has Russia possibly provided or can provide for India beyond this defense on, say, Afghanistan and China? Let's put it like that.
The way I like to frame it is that the US is an essential partner for India's maritime interests. When you look at maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean region, further east, I mean, it's the US, the Quad that you work with, right? And that's critical. But the US is, especially after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, not present on the Eurasian mainland, on the continent itself. So your continental security needs, because India is both a maritime and a continental power, your continental needs require you to work with people on the continent. And who's that? That's Russia, that's Iran. I mean, there's a whole host of actors. We now have reactivated our Central Asian diplomacy for that reason. because we do have interests and needs there where we need to work with others to achieve them. So it seems to me that if you frame it in that way, then you look at it slightly differently. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And again, it's not a question of balancing. It's a question of pursuing your interests and finding partners to do so. And this is, unfortunately, a confused world where you will have to find different partners for different things.
So that requires a more robust relationship with Russia. I mean,
with Russia.
Beyond defense, on many other aspects, including diplomatic alignments, exchanging assessments on Afghanistan, where, I mean, these days, probably Russia is the actor that most delivers to India on Afghanistan, no?
Well, I don't know the details of what, but certainly we do have an interest in, a common interest against extremism, terrorism, radicalism coming out of Afghanistan. And I think today Russia, like even China and Pakistan, are discovering that, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan is not an unmixed blessing for them. They have to deal with the consequences.
So on the China-Russia angle, I may promote your book now.
Thank you.
India and Asian Geopolitics by Ambassador Menon, which came out last year. And related, Russia shows up once or twice. Your paper on what is driving Chinese foreign policy. It's a paper that we launched recently here by Ambassador Menon on the internal drivers of Chinese foreign policy. And on both, Russia shows up as an actor that has looked westwards, Ukraine, Central Asia a little bit, but actually opened up space for China. I think those are two statements you make there, that it's become easier for China to fill some spaces because of Russia's preoccupation towards the West in particular. Does this make India's job more difficult in balancing this Eurasia Indo-Pacific relationship? Or in the typical Delhi mantra, is Russia a distraction for the West? And is it making more difficult to keep everyone's eyes on the main ball, China?
I think it's true that over the last decade and a half, the West has sort of pushed Russia into Chinese arms, as it were. And for the first time in history, China is pushing at an open door in inner Asia, in Asia. She's not used to this at all. I mean, traditionally, this has been her big security concern, the land, her continental frontiers. So yes, it has made our life more complicated in Asia, on continental Asia. But, as I still believe that ultimately each of these countries will follow their own self-interest when it comes to issues. There might be some congruence between China and Russia on certain issues, and certainly vis-a-vis the West in today's situation, they both seem to have considerable congruence. But I don't see levels of coordination between them that suggest an alliance or anything. In fact, there's a big debate. Did President Putin tell Xi Jinping what was going to happen in the Ukraine when they signed that joint communique on the 4th of February, and when he went for the Beijing Winter Olympics, met Xi Jinping?
Or maybe Prime Minister Modi when he came in December, maybe he was.
Well, but it doesn't seem to me that was the case. So it's not that level of coordination, even vis-a-vis the West. What it is that each one's individual actions in their own interest seem to help the other, to the extent that they try and build space for themselves, alternate orders, dealing financially, lessen the Western ability to use sanctions, etc. So that's slightly different. So given that, if that is the case, and February 4th certainly marked a shift. It marked a shift on the Chinese side. For the first time, they signed on to Russian views of European security by saying NATO should not expand.
And vice versa, Taiwan.
Taiwan, they've always said Taiwan is part of China. I mean, they've said that from the 50s. So I don't see a Russian shift there. In fact, it's China who shifted towards Russia and adjusted her European policy. That doesn't suggest that they expected what happened to happen, to see Europe completely polarized by a Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And if you look at commentary in the Chinese media, they're now allowing criticism, not quite criticism, but at least much more open discussion of the negative consequences of the invasion, the war, and so on, in the social media and even in the official media for the first time. Because China has huge equities with the US, with the West, and she is dependent on the West in many fundamental ways. People tend to forget this, that interdependence works both ways. It's dependence.
And Chinese banks have been deeply involved in the Russian economy.
So I'm not sure that when we say that we will face secondary effects that we need, same is true of China, in fact, probably on a greater scale, even than ours, because they're even more integrated in the global economy. So it seems to me that to say that things have shifted fundamentally, they've shifted fundamentally in terms of the European security order. But in terms of the world order, I'm not so sure yet.
So on this February 4th statement between President Putin and President Xi, Ambassador Shamsaran mentioned it as an inflection point, possible inflection point in world order. It's also, I mean, it's 5,300 words. It is a more than detailed document in terms of converging views on world order. It also speaks about democracy. I mean, a whole chapter on democracy is a universal human value that must be protected and cherished. So at what point do you think it's worth looking at this carefully, at this Russia-China statement? And what would India maybe agree with some parts in that statement?
You know, all these words, democracy, sovereignty, territorial integrity, for great powers like China, Russia, the US, they mean what they wanted to mean at that time. I don't think their definition of democracy is quite the same as ours or the US definition or the British definition. It's the same with, and the fact that they spend so much time on democracy suggests a certain sensitivity, that they do feel challenged by this democratic narrative. But that's not what drives their actions. This is part, I mean, statements are part of attempting to manage and control the narrative. But narrative doesn't drive decisions or actions on the ground. It's not narrative that determines that Russia will invade Ukraine. No. It's her interest and what's happening on the ground, the opportunity that the situation they think presents them. And so, yes, statements are useful because they show you what people think, how far, what they want you to believe. Signaling, narrative, useful, but it has its limits.
So limits to this China-Russia relationship also, there is a certain convergence, but at the same time we
limits, I
should
think,
be...
are placed by geography, by their history, and by their own versions. They both are now in the process of constructing an imagined past, each of them. And they, you know, I mean, you've heard President Putin spend more than an hour telling you his version of history, of modern history. The Chinese have been doing this for some time. But they're not the same histories, by the way. So they're not going to, so it doesn't, I think there's wonderful material there to be analyzed. And there's whole PhD theses and all this. But I wouldn't think that it has immediate practical effect in that sense. This is a year when China is going to be very careful. They have the 20th Party Congress. Xi Jinping comes up for a third term. He's not going to run risks which could lead to mistakes which then affect his future.
But there is a lot of revisionist language in that statement from China and Russia.
They are revisionist, no question.
And an appropriation of some language. I mean, when you say democracy is wonderful, and this is our type of democracy, this is our type of territorial integrity, etc., you are actually claiming certain concepts and giving them a new twist, which I agree every power has done. But my point is, to what would you say in that statement is actually understood in India? For example, the importance of NATO abandoning its ideologized Cold War approach, respects sovereignty, security, and interests, spheres of influence of other countries. That's probably something India agrees with.
Yeah. No, I don't think we'd quarrel with many of the words in that. But the fact is, today you have a very strange situation in the world. Most of the major powers are revisionist. across the board. I mean, it's not just Russia and China. The US is revisionist. And the US is not going back to the old liberal international order. They're not going back to WTO.
It's not hanging on to it?
They're not going back to WTO. They're not going back to TPP. I mean, if you look at their economic behavior, it's completely different from what it was in the neoliberal sort of paradigm after 1990. So,
as a function of relative weakness, by the way, also. Right?
Whatever the reason. I mean,
and a need to rethink.
India's revisionist. We're not happy with the world order the way it is. We want to have a bigger say. You know, Japan is changing drastically. I mean, if you look at the kinds of things she's saying on Taiwan, the way she's, developing as a military power, and behaving as a normal power. So you have this. That's why I like to call it a world adrift, because if all the major powers are revisionist, I mean, here's Germany rearming, so then you can't then just go by the words.
Interesting times.
Interesting, confused, worrying in many ways, but not a time to sit still or be reactive.
And try to appease everyone.
You can't.
Two last questions. One on this maritime versus continental dimension in Indian foreign policy. The Quad leaders met yesterday evening, Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. Has Russia helped to Eurasianize the Quad? The Quad yesterday was mostly about the Ukraine crisis, which is a deep hinterland issue, far away from that maritime dimension you had mentioned before that characterizes the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. So is Russia actually making the Quad more relevant, or even India's engagement in the Quad broader?
I think both in Europe and in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, what Russia has done is actually polarized countries. And in fact, that's exactly why I say we need an independent position. Because what Russia has done, and what the US is doing also, is to say, choose between them or us, right? But that is not, I think, a way forward. I don't think it offers a constructive future. I think, therefore, our job is really to try and provide an off-ramp and to suggest ways forward. Frankly, in the past, we've done this. We were unpopular when we did it. Whether it was issues like Iran, Myanmar, but ultimately the world has come around to that. And I think this is another time when we need to speak up for India.
So what's the relevance of the Quad in that for India?
I'd like to see what the Quad actually does. Words are words, as I said. But I'm not so sure that the Quad is going to do very much.
So it's more of a signaling device
individual
again?
members of the Quad, yes, will implement sanctions depending on their interests. Japan has already announced considerable whole set of sanctions against Russia, Australia also. I mean, they will do what they will, but I don't see them getting involved on the ground or actually affecting the situation on the ground very much.
So the Quad, in a sense, they're
as
more
a Quad.
Auxiliary
individuals,
element.
Yes, but not the Quad itself.
So it's an auxiliary element to India's main priority, in your view, which is that individual Indian independent foreign policy that needs to be communicated and then pushed through. Good. One last question. We do a lot of work, as you know, under your guidance here on South Asia, regional connectivity, this new subcontinent and its immediate neighborhood, and the contradictions, again, that you lay out in your book on India and Asian geopolitics between interdependence, connectivity, and political and security fragmentation, tensions, etc. Looking at this from India's smaller neighbors, Nepal and Bhutan, for example, must be quite worrisome to look at all of this being stuck between India and China, spheres of influence, rights of intervention.
I don't know if they're worried about India and China, because I think that many of them see that as an opportunity to actually make both India and China more responsive to what they would like out of the relationship. But I do think they are uncomfortable with the larger situation, where essentially what you're facing now is an economic slowdown, possibly stagnation. You're seeing much higher energy and other prices, and all of us in South Asia really depend on the rest of the world for energy, for commodities. for countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, which depend on tourism, and quite apart from the damage the pandemic did, this doesn't suggest that we're going back to normal very soon. So yes, I think they will look first at the economic prospects. And that, in a sense, opens an opportunity for India to actually step up its economic game in the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region.
But for all these states, let's extend it to Southeast Asia now, a bit broader, these states that are caught in this turbulence and this world that you described in rather scary terms as being about spheres of influence, about, I mean, we went back to the 19th century today. Yeah. We don't need to be scared about, you can't scare us more, but I assume that many of these states, the lessons they take from the Ukraine is that the dangers of aligning and putting your eggs into one basket, number one. The second, the possible merits of this approach, you call it the non-aligned, neutralist, demilitarized, if I may extend it further, of keeping really completely independent and away from these, and India and China and the US also, main actors that are really trying to extend, preserve their spheres of influence. Is that what you would do if you were decision makers in these countries? I know you hate this question, but please.
I'm glad I'm not a decision maker anyway.
In Nepal these days.
Which is why I can say what I think. But I do believe that if we were to take a forward-leaning position like I described,
for these small states, smaller states,
many countries would find that comforting and useful and would actually be willing to support it. And countries that you wouldn't expect. I mean, if you look at the Israeli behavior since the Russian invasion, they were very careful. They refrained from criticizing the Russians right through. And considering their ties with the US and how close they are, they co-sponsored and voted for the General Assembly resolution condemning the Russians, but then immediately made balancing statements, trying to suggest neutrality, because they had huge equities. For them, I mean, air superiority in the Middle East, on which they base their security, can only be challenged by the Russians, who are already in Syria, who have, have the ability to jam them and actually can control Syrian airspace. So for them, it's critical to their security to be careful. So it's not just small South Asian, Southeast Asian countries. There's a host of countries who would welcome a way out of this. And this choice that Russia and the US are offering you of choose a side.
So you'd put India together with these smaller South. There's a convergence, because I'm not sure how everyone looks at India sometimes. India would be in that middle league with its own sphere of influence that may sometimes intervene, and be playing balancing games with China, the US, that erode the autonomy of the Southeast Asian states.
Look, this is primarily a European problem we're talking about, right? It's about European security order. And as far as Europe is concerned, we are a distant power. But the rest of us are all sort of middle powers. Even China has very limited influence on what happens in Europe. I mean, she might be a superpower in Northeast Asia. No, just Northeast Asia. But even there, she's constrained. So I think you'd find these distinctions, small state, middle state, great power, I think you'd find support for that kind of position across the board.
Excellent. Ambassador Menon, thank you so much
for
enlightening us on this war. That's what it is.
I don't think I enlightened anybody.
No, you absolutely did. It's a pleasure to have you here at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, and hope to host you not on another war, but on another timely issue in future for India's foreign policy.
Thank you. Thank you, T.